Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. Mark Green is a business and leadership growth coach to CEOs and executive teams around the world. He's worked with thousands of leaders, helping them unlock more of their own potential and learn how to do the same for their teams. He's the author of 2 books, Activators, A CEO's Guide to Clearer Thinking and Getting Things Done, and Creating a Culture of Accountability, which reflects his passion for developing leaders and building healthy, high-performing business cultures. Mark teaches on Simon Sinek's online learning platform. He works in partnership with the Growth Faculty, and he serves as an advisor and mentor within the Gravitas Impact coaching community, where he's also a contributor to the 7 attributes of Agile Growth Framework. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brad. It's great to be here. It's quite a mouthful on the introduction, but thank you for that.
No, it is absolutely my pleasure. If only one had less accolades. Tell us, how did you come to be with such accolades? Or moreover, tell us a little bit about your journey. How do you, where did you come from? Tell us about your brief overview of your career, and then maybe land on what do you do with people today?
Yeah, for sure. Middle of 3 boys, grew up just north of New York City in Westchester County. And so as the middle child, I think I was pretty typically the middle child. Went away to school about 1,000 miles from home in St. Louis, studied psychology and business. And that was, I think, where the seeds were sown, although I didn't quite know it at the time. Spent the first 10 years of my career in technology services, totally unrelated, parachuted out of there and worked for some small companies and really sort of opened my eyes to the entrepreneurial space. And to make a long story short, I wound up in a spot where I woke up one day and said, you know what, I never want to work for anyone again, and I'm going to go do my thing. And in 2003, Performance Dynamics Group was launched as a leadership development training company. And that was version 1.0 of my business. We've evolved since then, and it wasn't until 2009 that I put my current business model in place, where I'm working now with high-performing mid-market firms, coaching the CEO and the leadership team as a team, which should sound awfully familiar to you and probably to many of your listeners.
Indeed, indeed. So I guess when I think about Mark Green, I think about accountability. I think about probably not tolerating mediocrity, and these are just from the gut. It's not a flag, and it's really like the deep passion that you have for helping people to unblock is probably the third thing. If I was constrained to 3. So what's the most surprising blocker that you would say that you've seen or that you regularly see in clients, and how do you begin to unpack it?
It has to be fear. It's fear. And, it's interesting because, like you, I work with very smart, very accomplished, very successful people and it's such a privilege. I don't take it for granted. It's such a privilege. And it's important for me to characterize it this way because people on the outside looking in have this impression like these people that we work with or that I work with have it made. They're super successful, everything's great. And that's not always the case. There's always room to improve. And so I view my role with my clients as a chief bar raiser. That's my role on the team. And I hold them to account. And my expectation is every time I show up, they're just a little bit better than they were before. But relative to accountability and a blocker, it is absolutely fear. And there are fears of ego, which is, well, what will people think of me if I do this thing, or if I, have a hard conversation with somebody who needs a hard conversation? Fears of scarcity, that's the second class, which is, well, what if they get mad and leave? And then I'll have to replace them. And that's hard to do. So there's a scarcity theme there as well. And then finally, and this is a little bit less common in the context of accountability, but more common in other areas, is a fear of existential failure. Not transactional failure, like, oh, this product launch or this software thing will fail, but rather I'm not going to be a successful person. This whole thing is going to fail. And again, that's a little less common here. Mostly it's ego and scarcity relative to accountability. And the challenge is to help my clients see the fear, see it, acknowledge it, because in most cases they're unaware. They just know that they're not having a conversation that maybe they should have. And so it's about helping them acknowledge the fear, tie the overcoming of that fear to their own development and their own aspirations, like what they want, and also help them understand that by not acting because of the fear, they're actually damaging people and relationships in the business that are not just the person that they need to talk to, but all around that person and throughout the company. And that's actually counteracting what they say they stand for and what they say they want. So it's about awareness, but then also really clarifying the stakes, if you will.
That I find that really interesting, because in the entrepreneurs organization, in the clients that I work with, in YPO clients that I work with, I kind of can see the same thing in a lot of cases. And it shows up in things like I grew up poor, or I have to prove something to my parents, or there are these kind of underlying things, which is kind of interesting that you've got the psychology side as well in your background. But do you find that once they take that fear from the subconscious and they then think about, okay, so I acknowledge this fear, that then they think, what's going to be my fuel? Am I going to actually not have, because that fuel made me terribly successful. And so now if I don't have that fuel driving me, which was that fear from before, is there a risk that I will now move forward and I will lose the passion that I've got? I don't think it's logical, I'll point out, but do you ever find people saying that?
I actually think the scenario you're painting, Brad, is pretty rare. I think it's very rare for me to encounter an entrepreneur who is whose primary motivation is avoiding something bad. It's kind of like the saying, you can't cut your way to success, or you can't, if you focus on what you don't want, you probably get more of what you don't want than what you want. And so I don't think it's a dominating thought. I think they simultaneously have the fear and the issue and, whatever they grew up with and all of that. I mean, we all do, right? We all have our own baggage. And believe me, there's no way I would have accomplished what I've accomplished in my practice if I didn't go through my own. And that was a really hard time for me. But when I figured it out, it was transformative. And it's really the same with my clients. So I think the motive is still pure. Like, they want to build something great. They want to do it for the employees. They want to do it for the industry. Those kinds of things are motivating to them, but they tend to look at the thing they're avoiding very transactionally. And I think that's also part of why it's easier for them to excuse themselves from it. And by the way, lest you think this is like some instant dawning where, Magic Mark shows up and we have a conversation and the CEO goes, oh, now I see it. And then they walk out their door and 5 minutes later have the conversation they were talking about. That's not how it works in the real world. In fact, I've had clients that have literally taken years from when I initially opened the door to this conversation to come all the way around to it at their own pace, the way they needed to go do what they needed to do. And the conversation thereafter is always the same. It's some version of, you know what, Mark? I should have done this 18 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
You know, and it's great. But even the fact that they've had the conversation, it's not an indicator of a permanent fix either.
Yep.
They still struggle with it, and it takes repetition like anything. So one of the things I've learned as a practitioner that I didn't have initially, and this was a part of my own work, was a lot of empathy for my clients.
Yeah.
You know, and appreciating their journey and the difficulty of their journey. And so I used to get very wrapped up around, well, they're not where I think they should be. And that's a problem for me. And what I came around to is, of course, that's very misguided and selfish, and came around to giving them grace and appreciating their journey and understanding that they are where they are. And the best that I can do as a practitioner is meet them where they are and help them identify and then take whatever the next one or two steps are from where they are.
It's exactly what we say. I literally word for word, we've got to meet them where they're at. And what's really funny that I think you would find interesting, Mark, is I had a guy called Ashley Ross on the podcast. He's a world famous sports coach. So he's coached internationally successful sports teams from cricket to rugby to gymnastics. Mm-hmm. And he pretty much said the same thing word for word. We've got to meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
And I guess that it's a part of the transition from facilitator or teacher to coach. And really the coach has to meet them where they're at, have that great empathy and know what to say, when, how to react and apply, right? That's kind of what we do. So you say that accountability is often the real problem hiding behind missed targets and underperformance. Makes sense as a statement, right? Certainly for me. How can a CEO who's listening start diagnosing where it's breaking down?
Yeah. So the first thing to think about, and one of the problems I uncovered when I started my work on the book was to really understand what accountability was.
Yeah.
And this is beyond the dictionary definition, which of course I had to handle that, but beyond the dictionary definition, to really understand, because you know this, you hear this, well, we have an accountability problem, right? And if you then said, well, okay, but what does that actually mean? You're going to get any number of answers, right? It's like this big amorphous thing is accountability. And so I had to unpack that. And what I came to is that there are actually 3 elements of accountability. And when we understand the elements, it becomes a lot easier to understand perhaps where we need to focus or do our work to solve something in the organization that we need to solve. The first element is role accountability. And the key question there is, does every person in my company understand the top 3 outcomes that are expected from their role in exchange for us funding their salary? Mm-hmm. Now that sounds a little harsh, but it's worded that way very deliberately for leaders to get a little light bulb moment and come to the idea that when you hire someone, you are making an investment, because there's other places you could put those resources, that financial resource, right? There's a lot of other things you can do with your money in a business, but if we're hiring
I say it
someone,
to them straight. Mate, I say to the leadership team, you got to understand that entrepreneur sitting on the corner can make an invest. He can take your salary and invest it somewhere else. And the rate that you're performing, perhaps you could even get a better return.
Yeah. So does everybody have clarity on the 3 top outcomes that are expected from their role in exchange for their salary? And I'll zero in on the word outcomes here because it's remarkably hard. In my experience, it's a remarkably hard thing for leaders to learn how to do. We're very tuned in to speaking in verbs. We manage, we operate, we run, we sell, we ensure, we protect, we invest, all these things we do, right? None of which, by the way, are outcomes, right?
Yes.
So what's an outcome? Well, how about operating profit, client satisfaction, NPS, ENPS, percentage of A players on your team? Outcomes are nouns, activities are verbs. So that's the role accountability piece, number 1. Number 2 is process accountability. So although we have roles in our organization chart, and that's what makes the organization chart nice and pretty, any business I've ever run into has processes that cut across the entire organization, right? Think about the process of acquiring a new customer, setting them up in your system, and then actually executing business with them and servicing them over time, right? And making sure that the invoices go out and you get paid. And all of these things are, right, processes inside the business that run horizontally across your typical vertical type organization structure. And many processes don't have clear accountability. There is no owner of the process. And the rule of thumb for process accountability is single point. So the answer can't be, well, Mary and James are accountable for our customer acquisition process. To which I would respond, okay, then no one is accountable. And so it's got to be a single point of accountability. And so we have to look at our processes and whether we're embedding accountable thinking into how we are accomplishing the things that we're accomplishing. And I would also put like priorities and projects into this category as well, where there needs to be single point accountability. And that's all under the umbrella of process accountability, which is the second element of accountability. And I'll continue with the third, which is leading by example.
Yeah.
And this is executive level accountability. This is one of those things that I see all the time and never ceases to amaze me, that leaders of organizations are often deluded, self-delusional in the idea that they feel like people don't notice things, or they think they might make a decision or do something or cut a corner or this or that. And it's like, nobody's noticing. Everybody's noticing. Everybody knows. There's no secrets in an organization. And so you must, beyond a shadow of a doubt and beyond reproach, lead by example. And what that means is if you're telling your people that you expect them to be accountable, then are you delivering on the outcomes of your role? If you're saying that learning is important in your organization, are you doing that? And how do people know? And on and on and on and on. So feedback is an important piece of this, because if you indeed strive to lead by example, the only way you can know that you're being successful is if people tell you you're being successful. And so that's something else to think about there. And so that's the third element of accountability. And so if we bring it all the way back to your initial question, which is, how does a leader start to unpack an accountability issue? The first step is to ask, where does it fall? And the leading by example is always the place to start. That's always the place to start.
And so I want to just scratch a little deeper on that. Why should leaders start with themselves? Because it's kind of obvious you need to be a role model. I get that. Yeah. So what happens when leaders don't start with themselves?
So I would ask you to remember a time in your life, and ask the listeners to think back to a time in your life in either employment situation or maybe a volunteer situation or some group endeavor, to where you were in a situation where the person in charge was basically telling you to go do something that that they didn't do. Okay? So the do as I say, not as I do. And we've all had an experience, at least one, if not many, working for people like that, or being a part of an organization or a group or a team that's like that. Now, how did you feel at that time? First of all, did you know? Did you notice? Yeah. Yes. And how did you feel? And I think to the title of your upcoming book, and like, there's no scenario in which the do as I say, not as I do is a part of a great company. Like, it's just, it's not there. It can't be.
Yes.
Well,
it creates a credibility chasm, right? It creates a void of credibility, and it kind of dilutes the cohesiveness, I guess.
Yeah. And what it also does is and this will be a little deeper psychologically and maybe counterintuitive, but I think it weakens the leader too. Because
Absolutely.
No, but I mean, you're not just your position with other people, but inside, because it is very, very hard to live a double life, to live with dissonance, and that's not sustainable. That's where people lose sleep. That's where people start to turn to controlled substances. Like it's bad for long, long, long periods of time. It's very stressful. And the other thing I will tell you is that for people who sort of do this kind of a thing regularly, you can take a guess as to how they lead their private lives. And you can take a guess at the quality of their relationships with their families, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not a happy place. And this is back to me having empathy. I have great empathy for that.
Yeah.
And I can help people with that. But they have to be willing to do the work.
Of course they do. It just makes me think that everyone, and this is kind of where the empathy stems from perhaps, but everyone is doing the best job that they can.
Yes.
With the tools that they have. Now tools are not practical tools.
Resources. Yeah.
Resources, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it can sometimes put you into a situation that you don't want to be. Yeah. So I'd like to move on now and ask about what changes when each leader has their role accountability card. Can you describe the before and after effect of a role accountability card? So I'll just repeat that again. So when a leader gets their role accountability card, what changes? Can you describe the before and after effect in real terms?
Yeah. I think about this at the team level. So we'll just start with the CEO and their executive team. And when we do this exercise, and I initially ask everybody to take a stab at writing down what they think they're accountable for, the top three things, right? So first, there's two things that happen. The first thing is everybody writes verbs, activities, not outcomes, and that's okay because they're going through it the first time. But the second thing that happens is about 70% of the room winds up being accountable for the same three things. Okay, and if you roll back to our conversation around process accountability, I would say, well, then no one's accountable, right? No one's accountable for that. And if you look at the results and you look at where that company's at, you can actually draw a line from this finding back to the reality of what's happening, right? And so the idea is that we then go through it and we fix the verbs into nouns and we make it clear that, who's actually accountable for what at what level in the organization. And the first reaction when it starts to get close to being done is just one of incredible clarity that they've never had before. And that's actually what you want. I mean, this is about clarity. Clarity scales, simplicity and clarity scales. And so that's usually the thing, because then, people can go off and start to tell their teams like, hey, this is actually where we need to focus more. And then when it comes to subsequent months and quarters and reporting results and all of those kinds of things, you're in a much more crisp environment.
Yeah.
And again, like everything we do, there's no light switch where it happens overnight, but it's a process, but it's the beginning of the process. And the first lightning bolt is the lightning bolt of, we have never had this clarity before.
I was working with a team maybe a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and we built scorecards with the team. One of the team members said to me that they had only 50% of the things that they were doing day to day were what they were supposed to be doing. So there's half of the things that they weren't even doing, number one. And number two, that there was 50% of things they didn't even know that they were supposed to do. So yeah, like I think that clarity that you speak of is just so critically important. So I'd like to ask you about something that I've heard you say before, that what you tolerate as a leader becomes the norm. So what do you think are the most dangerous things that CEOs accidentally tolerate, and how do you coach them to stop doing that?
So the things I think that CEOs tolerate, and I'm not sure it's accidental. I don't think it's accidental, but I think they tolerate it, but they excuse themselves tolerating it. I would say that they excuse themselves tolerating it. Violations of the culture, like violations of core values, particularly from high performing people.
The toxic A's.
Which we call, in extreme, that's a toxic high performer. Yeah. And I also feel like they tolerate lower performance from like long-standing employees or their partners or their senior team because there's this little thing called emotional entanglement that tends to get in the way of some of that. And, it's the same conversation for me as it is with fear, because again, that's what's causing them to tolerate it. So let me back up here for the listeners. So when you tolerate something, again, there's this delusion that like it's not a thing, nobody notices. But the problem is everybody notices and everybody sees you tolerating it. And so the issue is that if you're tolerating underperformance or let's say not appropriate values-based behavior from somebody, then your company is witnessing that. And the reality is that what you're tolerating becomes the acceptable standard.
Yeah.
And that's the tyranny of tolerating something. And that's the thing that leaders don't think about, right? It's like I have this other saying, Brad, it's, don't focus on the 5%, focus on the 95%. And so you're focusing on the 5%, let's say the one person that you're excusing, but you're not thinking about the message that that's sending to the 95% who are actually people who are performing and fitting into your culture and getting the work done and doing all these things for you. And when you start to turn the math around mentally and you start to focus on the 95% instead of the 5%, it becomes an awful lot easier to get off the dime and begin to engage in a meaningful way instead of tolerating whatever it is you're tolerating.
Because all of the other staff are saying, why is she or he not acting on this? Why this, like, it's incongruent to them. That like they don't get it. It's like they say these things, but then like, why does this person do this? And again, I guess like you said before, it really weakens them as a leader. And it kind of makes me think about, in both of your books, you've drawn a hard line between what it means to be respected and what it means to be liked. So, and I definitely get the sense that for you, it's like you must be respected. That's really important. So what's your advice for leaders who say that that they're fearing losing morale if they raise standards?
Yeah. So the research is really clear. I did a bunch of research into this in activators, and people perform to the level of expectation that is set. Full stop. And so if you don't expect a whole bunch from your people, guess how they're going to perform? Whereas if you hold them to a high standard, miraculously they will perform to a high standard. And I've seen this play out on both sides of the coin with clients over the years. I've also seen it. I just lost my train of thought. So I've seen this play out.
Yeah.
So to raise the bar as a leader is actually doing your people a favor. People enjoy striving for things. Now, they don't enjoy being on impossible missions or, never being able to be successful, but they do enjoy the feeling of some challenge, and as opposed to just the same old thing or a very, very low bar. And so, again, the research is really clear on this, that, you have to hold high expectations for yourself and others if you want a high performing team. And then we're back around to the fear, which is, well, what if people leave? And my question in response to that conversation is, well, who do you suppose on your team would be most likely to leave if you raised the bar on your expectations?
That's really interesting.
And the answer, of course, after a little bit of thinking is, well, I suppose the people who are not our highest performers. And of course, I respond to that something like, well, isn't that interesting? The other thing, anecdotally, with expectations, I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where I've been helping a client install core values, okay, or do a meaningful refresh of their core values. And my process isn't about posters on the wall. I mean, we're building culture here. There's a way to do it, and there's work to be done. And it seems that it's often that when we're in the process of doing that, the executive team thinks about their people. and they start to handicap and put bets on some of their people, and they think, well, boy, I got this guy, Brad, and he's, you know what? There's no way he's going to make it when we put these core values in. Like, there's no way this guy's going to make it, right? And what I've learned as a coach is to ignore all of that, because when you install core values in an organization and start to create accountability to them, you are raising expectations, right?
Yeah.
You're also creating clarity where clarity didn't exist before, because there were never a set of clear rules about behavioral expectations, and now there are. And I always get amused, because then 6 months later, somebody comes back to me and they go, Mark, you're never going to believe it. Brad is like our core value superstar. He's like the guy.
Yeah.
What happened? And, and it's like, well, you created clarity for him. You showed him the rules. Like, how can you reasonably expect someone to behave in alignment with a set of rules that don't exist? And I feel like that's where we are a lot of time. And the good news is we have the tools and the process, to help with that and create the clarity. And, the impact on the performance of the organization, and getting everybody firing on all cylinders and rowing the boat in the same direction, it's massive.
I'm going to pick up on what you said earlier. What's the difference between posters on the wall, in the way you described it, and installing core values?
So I tell my leadership teams, my clients, this very clearly. I have very few what I call dogmatic zones in my coaching. And a dogmatic zone for me means we're going to do it exactly my way, or we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of my coaching is sort of, let's figure out how to make this work for you. And that makes sense, because we have to meet our clients where we are and all of that. Creating and installing core values is a dogmatic zone for me. And the reason is that if they're serious about building culture, there's one way to do it.
Yeah.
And it starts with creating the core values the right way. They have to be crystal clear and behaviorally defined. And I warn my clients in advance, and it's just, there's a lot of backing and forthing, and it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But when we get it, and it's really great. And then the second thing, not surprisingly, is the executive team's integrity with their own core values. Yeah. And I will not let them announce or roll out or discuss the core values with the rest of the company until, as their coach, I am comfortable that they are in integrity with their own core values. And what I actually do is I have them start to add a round in their daily huddle where initially they're calling themselves out for violations, and then they give themselves permission to call one another out for violations. Yeah. And I track those conversations, because if those conversations aren't happening, I will not let them release the core values to the organization. And this can take months. And it's kind of like, Mark, are we ready yet? Well, tell me, when's the last time you tapped one of your colleagues on the shoulder and said, you're not living this core value, and here's something I just saw you do. And so again, we get there so that when we do hit the launch button, they have integrity, and we can launch it to the team. And then, without getting into the details, there's a whole process for that, and we create a contest and a lot of energy. But this is a process from stem to stern that could take 6 months to do it the right way. But the biggest consumption of time is getting the definitions right, and then the senior team's integrity.
Yeah, it's pretty important, that's for sure. And I think in my experience, if it takes time, it's worth it, because I've seen people ask marketing companies, for example, to write their core values, and they come back with, sure, they do some exploratory work or surveys or whatever, but they come back with something and it's just not authentic.
Yeah.
You talk about these 9 non-accountable behaviors in your work. I'm really quite curious, what's the one that leaders often miss in themselves, do you think? And what's the consequence?
There's a bunch, boy. I would say letting teams, I'll pick letting teams or people off the hook. So I've been in meetings with an executive team, like a quarterly meeting, and we're going through the dashboard, and the dashboard has some green, some yellow, some red, kind of normal dashboard. But the team was just glossing right over all the yellows and the reds. And I let them go because it was very interesting to me to sort of watch this happen. They were just, everybody was reporting out, and then we'd go to the next person, they report out, go to the next person, they report out. And they seemed like they were ready to move on. And I said, hey, let me ask you a question. Am I the only one that sees the yellow and red up there? Or is there yellow and red up there? And like, why didn't anybody mention that or have a question for, and it's like what was happening was they were accepting the result and they were just letting people off the hook. And so there's no accountability in that, right? Now, it doesn't mean that the position should be, shaking a finger saying, Brad, why didn't you hit your number, right? That's not what I'm talking about either.
Yeah.
But what I am talking about is, hey, it seems like we've got an issue with the performance, the consistency in our customer service interactions. Is this something we need to put into an IDS topic or a topic for us to talk about in today's meeting? Or should we maybe take this offline and figure out what we need to do about this? And that's an accountable behavior because you're seeing something, you're saying something, and you have a bias toward doing something about it.
When should a leader know? I know it's personal, but when should a leader know when to switch from being hard on the discipline, like there is only green or super green, yellow and red are not acceptable, over to empathy? Is there any, consideration? Not consideration, but what's your take on that?
Yeah. There has to be yellow and red.
Yeah.
There has to be yellow and red. And my thinking on this is really clear. If there's no yellow and red, you're not doing hard things. You're not pushing yourself, or you're not setting worthy enough goals and objectives. And that doesn't mean that you should set goals that set people up to fail. But you're not really pushing the boundary. And so, I think that should be normalized. Not everything should be green, because if we're doing worthy, hard things, we're going to struggle with it. And by the way, this is the other thing, that if you bring it all the way back to like having a hard conversation with somebody, like we started today, you should have to do that, because it's not normal to have everything be great all the time, particularly if as an organization, you're in the process of scaling and growing and changing, because it's going to naturally it's going to create that over and over and over time as you outgrow your phase 1 team, and then you will outgrow, believe it or not, your phase 2 team, and then you will outgrow, the next team. I have a client right now. It's a couple $100 million heavy construction business, and they're hiring their first chief operating officer from the outside. And this change is going to cause 3 people on the executive team to have a new boss. Okay, it's a $200 million company. And by the way, they're super successful, super profitable. They just went ESOP. Their culture is incredible, and their strategy and business model is on point. They are high performing by any measure. But there is nobody in that business who knows how to continue to scale their operation. And so they are going outside for that. And these are normal things that should be happening if you are doing the right things as you're scaling and growing your company.
That's awesome. You talk about a manager becoming a coach. So we've got it's the leadership or leader as a coach concept. What's your advice for leaders who look at their team, hear that they need to turn their managers into coaches, but don't know what to do? Like, what's your sort of take on that? How would you react to that?
So the first baby step is to start to focus on dramatically increasing the volume of feedback that's occurring in the organization. And again, it starts with this. It starts with the CEO and the leadership team. I'm actually working on an article right now that is around this idea that I have this sense that there's this epidemic of like lousy feedback, or not enough feedback. Okay.
Yeah.
And by the way, positive and constructive, both, not one or the other, both. And it's really costly. It's really, really costly. But if you think about coaching as an idea, one of the anchors of coaching is feedback, because that's what you're building on, essentially, is observation and noting things and acknowledging things. And so it starts with starting the feedback more. And this is hard for teams, as we've talked about today. It's hard, to look across the table at somebody and say, boy, what you said earlier really triggered me. And, I want to talk to you about that, because if I tell you that, then now all of a sudden, like, are you going to come back at me with something? Like, you're going to say, well, yeah, but Mark, you know what you did to me last week? And you know what? But you could be right. But if we don't have the conversation, we never know. We don't know that, right? And so we have to normalize feedback, because when we realize at our level that this is healthy and constructive and nobody dies and, nobody's angry and like it's all good, it becomes easier to do with our teams. The other thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is this idea of looking at feedback through the lens of course correction, not major trauma. And it's this idea that if I'm course correcting someone, I'm giving them more comments that are very minor over time. Kind of the way that an airplane might fly from Perth to Sydney. They don't just set a course and fall asleep, but the reality is the plane is constantly correcting itself for winds and atmospheric conditions and all kinds of things that are going on, so that when you look at it in the big picture, it makes this beautiful straight arc to the destination. But what we often do in leadership is the analogy of like the pilot saying, well, we're going to set off and our heading's going to be 90 degrees. We're going to wait 5 hours into the flight. Then we're going to figure out where we are, and then we'll adjust and make our way to Sydney. Yeah. Well, if I was going to get on that plane, I'd be like, dude, I don't want to get on your plane, because it's like you go this way and then you got to go that way. And as leaders, we do that. We wait and we don't give the feedback, and we don't give the feedback, and we don't give the feedback. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh man, I got to have this really heavy conversation with Joe. It's a huge problem, but a year ago it wasn't. And that's the thing that people have to start to see, is that this is healthy and normal, and course correction is the mental model that sets the stage to make the idea palatable and easier for leaders to embrace.
Because I believe, and I know that the research backs it up, that people want to get feedback. People want I'll say the negative feedback, but the constructive criticism feedback coming from a good place. The data supports that. So my new book is entitled Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. And so it frames the next question. For you, Mark, how would you describe a better business?
A better business has a culture that yields happy, focused people, and the business is able to generate the resources that it needs to be able to thrive and continue to grow and achieve the objectives of the investors over time.
Beautiful, beautiful. What is a book that you might recommend for our audience?
So I'm going to do a little twist on this, and I'm going to recommend a podcast instead of a book, actually a whole series. So I'm sure you've heard of Shane Parrish and the Knowledge Project.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Shane has done an outlier series on the Knowledge Project podcast, and that's what I'm going to recommend in lieu of a book. And he's got biographies. These are like 30 to 45-minute biographies on Harvey Firestone, Andy Grove, Rose Blumkin, who built the Nebraska Furniture Mart, who sold it to Warren Buffett, who said it was the best business he ever bought. Henry Singleton, who founded Teledyne Corporation. James Dyson, Dyson vacuum cleaner and fan, all that. And it is remarkable. I don't spend a lot of time reading biographies because I sort of get lost in all the minutia. But this is really great because they're concise stories and they're all entrepreneurial stories, and the patterns and the lessons are striking. And so that would be my book recommendation for today, would be to check out the Outlier series on the Knowledge Project podcast.
Wow. Okay. That is different. I like it that you've done different, and we will put the link for that in the show notes. How can people learn more about you and your practice?
Yeah, I'm pretty prolific on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter there. I post multiple times a week content for leaders growing firms. You can find me there at Coach Mark Green. And my website is mark-green.com. And you can find out more about me there and contact me there as well.
Lovely. What haven't we discussed that you wanted to cover off today?
Boy, I mean, we could spend 3 days here. You know that as well as I do. So I think we're good. And maybe at some point it'll be an opportunity to get invited back on for phase 2.
Lovely. Well, indeed, Mark, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I know your experience, first of all, but your deep passion around these topics. And yeah, it was great to get a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more. So thank you again, Mark.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.